My daughter's future. In-laws flew in from Europe to meet us. They spoke French the whole dinner, thinking I wouldn't understand. Then I heard what they said about my daughter, and I set down my fork. Couldn't stay silent any longer. When my daughter, Emily, called to tell me she was engaged, I cried harder than she did. She laughed over the phone and asked, "Dad, are you actually crying?" I smiled and told her I'd been crying over her milestones since she learned to walk. This was just another one worth celebrating. Emily was 31, a gifted pediatric surgeon with the kindest heart I'd ever known. She had spent years focused on her career before meeting Julian, a French architect living in New York. They fell in love slowly, built a beautiful relationship, and eventually got engaged. I couldn't have been happier for her. A week later, she called again, but this time her voice sounded nervous. "Dad, Julian's parents are flying in from Europe next month. They want to meet you before the wedding." I told her that sounded perfectly normal, but she hesitated before quietly adding, "They're very traditional. Just promise me you won't take anything personally if they seem a little cold." I chuckled and tried to lighten the mood. "Emily, I spent 38 years fixing electrical systems in factories, schools, and hospitals. I've dealt with angry contractors, impossible deadlines, and more than a few rude millionaires. I think I can survive one awkward dinner." She laughed, but I could tell it didn't ease her worries. Before hanging up, she quietly said, "Dad, I just really want everyone to get along." The dinner was scheduled at an elegant French restaurant overlooking the Hudson River. I almost insisted on taking everyone to my favorite family-owned steakhouse instead, but Julian explained that his parents had chosen the restaurant because it reminded them of home. I arrived 15 minutes early in the only tailored suit I owned, one Emily had secretly bought me for my retirement party years earlier. As I waited, I watched expensive cars pull up outside and wondered if I truly belonged in a place where the wine list looked thicker than most novels. Emily arrived first and wrapped her arms around me. "You look great," she whispered. I smiled and kissed her forehead, the same way I had when she was a little girl leaving for her first day of school. A few minutes later, Julian walked in carrying flowers for Emily. He greeted me warmly with a hug instead of a handshake, something I appreciated more than he probably realized. Then his parents entered. Henri Moreau stood tall with perfectly combed silver hair and the quiet confidence of a man who had spent his entire life being listened to. His wife, Colette, wore a tailored cream-colored dress and enough understated elegance to make everyone else in the room feel underdressed. They greeted Emily politely, kissed Julian on both cheeks, then turned toward me. Henri shook my hand with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "It is a pleasure to finally meet you," he said in flawless English. "The pleasure's mine," I replied. Colette nodded politely before glancing at my watch, my shoes, and then my hands. Years of working with electrical tools had left them rough despite retirement. Her eyes lingered for just a second too long before she smiled again. Most people would have missed that look. I didn't. I'd seen it before. Dinner started pleasantly enough. We talked about New York, Emily's work at the Children's Hospital, Julian's latest architecture project, and their plans for a small autumn wedding. Henri complimented the restaurant, while Colette spoke proudly about their hometown in southern France. For nearly half an hour, everything felt perfectly normal. Then the waiter cleared the appetizer plates. Henri switched to French. Colette answered in French. Julian joined them naturally. Emily smiled politely, trying to follow along with the little French she'd learned in college. But after a minute, she simply focused on her meal. Nobody at the table asked whether I understood, because they assumed I didn't. What they didn't know was that I'd spent almost a decade living in Montreal during my 30s, supervising electrical projects for an American engineering company. I had spoken French every single day back then. I hadn't used it much since returning to Ohio, but you never really forget a language that once became part of your life. So I quietly kept eating and listening. At first, their conversation was harmless. They discussed the quality of the wine, complained about the long flight from Paris, and joked about American coffee. Then Colette glanced toward Emily and lowered her voice just enough that she thought only her family could hear.